Welcome back. We're going to talk today about Roosevelt and progressivism. I'm your teacher and professor today. My name is Chris Erskine, and we're going to jump right in and look at Roosevelt and eras in American history and progressivism. And if you remember from the last couple of chapters, we've been talking about Roosevelt, American expansion, and a little bit about trust busting or monopoly busting. And so we're going to talk a little bit about progressivism today, and monopoly busting and trust busting is part of progressivism. So the first thing I want you to do on this first slide is look at the eras of American history. And the first era we can see would be, well, since 1800, since 1840s anyway. 1840 to 1860, we've got the age of expansion. Americans are growing, manifest destiny. We add much territory to the American map, moving west. Then 1860 to 1880, we have Civil War and the failure of Reconstruction. In 1880 to 1900, we have the age of industry and economic growth. That's Rockefeller, Carnegie, J.P. Morgan, those guys that we talked about in the last chapter. In 1900 and 1920, we have the expansion of American power and continuing economic growth, and we move into an age of progressive reform. And what might come next, do you think? From 1900, well, really 1900 to by 1920, we have this next thing, and it continues from the early part of the 1900s to just after 1920. And this is called progressivism. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So we see the next slide and we say progressivism. Well, time out, slow down. What is progressivism? What is it? Then and now. Well, in 1900, 120 years ago, progressivism was a movement that was in favor of the workers. If we have big businesses and they're treating the workers badly and making them work lots and lots of hours and not paying them very well, then the workers, you can see in this picture on this slide, progressivism, the workers work together and unite, and they're going to strike back and they're going to get their rights. And progressivism included busting big businesses, getting control of the workers' rights. It included a lot of other things that we're going to talk about in this lesson. But today, progressivism, it's really kind of the same thing. But when someone today says that they are progressive, generally that means that they are a little bit more liberal on the political spectrum. So if someone says they're progressive, you can think pretty safely that that means they're probably a Democrat. Now, conservatives would not say that they are progressive. They would not say that they're not progressive either. But most conservatives don't say that they're progressive. But they would also argue that the progress that they make is different from the progress that Democrats make. And so that's a discussion for a government class. But the difference between progressivism then and now, there are some differences, but basically it's the same thing. Now, if we look at the next slide, we see President Roosevelt, and this is a slide that you've seen before, and I want to show it to you again because it's worth remembering that Roosevelt is in office 1901 to 1909. Remember, his election was in 1900, and he left. The new election for the new president was in 1908, November, but the president stays in office until, and then it was until March. He is a Republican, he's from New York, and he is a progressive president. Today, Republicans are not generally viewed as progressives. It's usually the Democrats that are viewed as progressives. And Republicans would generally argue that that's a good thing that they're not progressive, not in the sense that the Democrats mean it, because conservatives say that they are preserving the good things about American culture and American values. Democrats would argue the same thing. But the parties have shifted a little bit from from the time of President Roosevelt to today. So on the next slide, we see from 1900 to 1920, we have white collar workers. Now, White-collar workers are people that are professionals. They might work in an office. And the number of white-collar workers, meaning that they're probably middle class, they have a little bit more money. The number of white-collar workers doubles from 5 million to 10 million in just those 20-year period. But the divorce rate also goes up. So married couples, they split. And it goes from 1 in 12 marriages to 1 in 9 marriages from 1900 to 1920. In 1870, 3% of all marriages. 1900, 8.1% of all marriages. And by 1920, 13.4% of all marriages ended in divorce. Today, it's something like over 50% in the United States. On the next slide, we see white-collar workers, again, college-educated, professional, and they're primarily Protestant, meaning they're not Catholic, they're Christian. I mean, Catholics are Christian as well, but they're Protestant Christians rather than Catholic Christians. They're usually white, and they're native-born, meaning that they're born in the United States, they're born as citizens, and usually they're middle class. Blue-collar workers means people that work in the factory and usually have less education. Are a mix of native-born and minorities, I mean African Americans, Asian Americans, Latinos, and also lots of immigrants. So they're not citizens. Some of them are not citizens. And generally speaking, they just don't have as much money. So they're lower class economically. Now on the next slide, we see that progressives are reformers. They want to change things. Some progressives are radicals, but generally progressives are not thought of as being radical. They just want to change things for the better. Often they're middle class, and they can be poor Americans, but often they're middle class. And they can also be rich Americans. The People's Party. Remember we talked about William Jennings Bryan a couple chapters back? The People's Party is mostly gone. But the ideas, and I mentioned this in the last lesson as well, or a couple of lessons back, those popular People's Party ideas are still there. There's a seed, and that seed is beginning to sprout, and it's going to bear fruit. So because of the People's Party, because of people like William Jennings Bryan, we see the end of an era of abuse of big business. It's trust busting under Roosevelt. We see an end of labor abuses with laws that protect how many hours people can work a day, and maybe some minimum wage laws. Reform in the workplace, safety. Do you have, is there insurance if you get hurt? Or can the owners use unsafe machines? So a lot of, not those necessarily, but and we're going to look at some of those ideas, some of those things that happened in the next lesson. But what I really want you to understand is kind of the general concept of what's taking place here. We're seeing reform in the workplace. The worker becomes more important than he or she has been before. And progressives don't have just one agenda. They don't just have, in English we call it labor, means to work. They don't just have one agenda as labor. They don't just want to improve conditions at work. They want to do lots of different things. And so if we look at the next slide, we'll see some of those agendas, some of those things that they have. Some are for controls on immigration. They want to slow the flow of immigration. Some don't. Some of them want primarily workplace reform for insurance, shorter working days, fewer hours. Some want to bust the monopolies or the trusts. Some believe in temperance and ending gambling and in ending the use of alcohol. It's called prohibition. Some of them want voter reforms. They want to give women the right to vote. And sometimes they focus on food and how unhealthy the factories were that made the food. And so they wanted some laws in place that would protect the healthfulness and the safety of the food that they would eat. During this time of a progressive era, President Roosevelt, the next President Taft, the president before Roosevelt, William McKinley, they have to get people to go vote for them. So how do they do that? Well, they have to talk to the people. Remember, McKinley would sit on his front porch and he had a front porch campaign. William Jennings Bryan had a whistle stop campaign where he'd stood on the back of a train. He would talk to people about these issues. Similar to how presidents in the United States and in China and everywhere do today, they can go on TV and they can travel and they can meet people and they can talk to people. And And so this list of things that encouraged people to go and vote for president was workers' protection, a safe workplace, breaking up big business, women's rights, racial issues between blacks and whites, or Asians or Latinos, people that come from South America, tax or tariff issues. Remember the gold standard that we talked about a couple of lessons ago. War, 1914, during the Progressive Era, we have World War I. Prohibition, alcohol, and consumer protections and food. Just the same things that we talked about on the last slide. And this is what encourages people to go and to vote. So, but more than that, it's not just those issues. It's not just the politicians and the presidents and the people who want to be president who are talking about these issues. It's also the newspapers and the magazines and the media. And so if we look at this next slide of progressivism, we can see what's called muckraker journalism. And this is where you're scraping the bottom, looking for things that will get people kind of angry or emotional and upset, things that are sensational. Journalists sometimes would go undercover. They would work in factories. They would say that they were a worker, but really they were a journalist. They would learn about the bad conditions in the factories or learn about the bad conditions in the slums or poor homes that people lived in bad neighborhoods, poor neighborhoods. And they were often journalists who wanted things to change, reform-minded or progressive journalists. And so this begins what we now call in English, and this is a good phrase for you to know, investigative journalism. One of those was Ida Tarbell. There's many, but one of them was Ida Tarbell. And she writes a history of the Standard Oil Company in 1904 and against John D. Rockefeller. And of course, Rockefeller doesn't like this because it exposes the vast amount of power that Rockefeller has. And he has the workers under his thumb, and he can do anything he wants. And ultimately, Standard Oil, which is what Rockefeller owned, is broken up. On the next slide, we see pictures of slums. And so really the progressives were trying to protect people who would live in homes like these. Now, these are not very nice. Maybe they're not very safe. And probably it's easier to catch disease because they're not clean either. And so the progressives wanted to end conditions like this. And people that lived in places like this, they did not want to live like this. The problem was they would go to work, and they would work for very little money and very many hours. And then they come home late at night, and they're so tired, and they go home the next day. And they very early in the morning work so many hours for so little money. And they come home late at night. And maybe they eat something on the table. Maybe their son or daughter, who's only 8 or 9 years old, will go with them to work because they have to work. They have to make money. And so the mom maybe decides she's going to cook some meat for supper. And they cook the meat, and part of it is rotten because there's no laws in place that protect the consumer, the person who buys the food, from the factory. And the factory can do whatever it wants to do. And so it's very dangerous and very unhealthy. And so progressives sought to end that practice. And that's where we're going to leave it off for now. But in the next lesson, we're going to talk specifically about some of the things that Roosevelt does and Taft. In this lesson, we kind of generally looked at the progressive movement. And in the next lesson, we're going to drill down and look very specifically. All right. We'll see you then. Bye-bye.